Me. We're just going to pray. Father God, we thank you that your presence is with us. We thank you that your love never fails. We thank you that what you did on that cross so many years ago is enough for us today. And we thank you that your love will continue to guide us, counsel us, and encourage us to be more like you. Amen. Today's reading comes from the book of Romans. If you've got the ancient text with you, feel free to get that out. Romans 5, 6 to 11. We're looking at the radical love of Christ. If you don't have it with you, it's on the screens. When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time, and died for us sinners. Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. And since we've been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son, while we were still enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his Son. So now we can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends of God. There's a lot in this passage. There is a lot. We could spend weeks just going through these few verses. Romans is like the theology. It's got so much theology packed into such small amount of words. And so we can't obviously do that, but there are some things that I really want to draw out with us today. 3 key words I want to focus on to start with. Helpless, ungodly, or in some versions it says sinners, and the third word is enemies. Paul is explicit. He is writing explicitly. He is showing us exactly what our relationship is like with God. Helpless, ungodly, sinners, enemies. That's brutal. Imagine you're walking down the street and someone's yelling these things at you. If you're not getting offended, I would question your hearing. Paul isn't trying to be kind. He is stating facts. We were helpless. We could not do a thing to save us. The word helpless in the Greek translate to literally helpless. Sometimes, when we say, we're so helpless, and then someone goes, well, if you just talk it through, or if you do this, or if you do that, you can help yourself, essentially. The Greek word is not that. It is quite the opposite. It is literally helpless, as in whatever you did would make no difference to the situation you're in. Whatever you tried to do would make no difference to the situation you're in. It is completely and utterly helpless. There's nothing you can do to help yourself in this situation. The word sinner or ungodly that Paul uses here, it's an old word. It's a word that's been around for a very long time, and I wonder how many of our younger people really understand what that word means. I wonder if I did, I'm not going to, but I wonder if I asked each person to raise their hand if they believe they're a sinner. How many hands would go up in the audience? How many of you identify as, yes, I am a sinner? Yeah, there's a few that put their hand up. Because to be a sinner is to not revere God as we should. It's a disobedience. And we've all been affected by sin. And it is still present in our lives today as it has been when Adam and Eve first entered the world. I then wonder if I did the opposite and said, put your hand up if you're a friend of God. Would the same hands go up? They do. Do you identify that you are a sinner and a friend? Can you be both? It's an interesting phrasing that Paul's using. Paul's drawing on a parallel. Sinners and friends. Can you be both? Now the word enemies, it's a big word. To be an enemy of something or someone. Who loves Sherlock Holmes? Just yell it out. Sherlock Holmes? Anyone? There's not many. Oh yeah, a few. Great. I love Sherlock Holmes. When my in-laws went to England, they brought me back cufflinks with his little pipe thing. Very cool. Not that I endorse smoking, but I love Sherlock Holmes. More specifically, I love the BBC version, the TV series with, I've got his name, Brendan, because I knew I'd forget it, Benedict Cumberbatch. Have you guys seen that one? Yeah, great. I love that one. What's interesting, and what I want to draw on, is season 1, episode 2. Specifically, just everyone cast your mind to that moment. Thank you. No, let me fill you in. Great. Watson has just found out who Sherlock is, and he's sort of like, this is interesting. Sherlock's brother sends him a car, and he's like, forces him to get in, and he meets Sherlock's brother. He doesn't realize they're brothers at this moment. All he knows him as is Sherlock's arch enemy. Now, I've never heard of a grown adult coming, saying, I've got this arch nemesis, I've got this arch enemy. I've never heard someone say that. I've heard kids all the time say, he's my arch enemy and I hate him. He's my enemy. And wow, but I've never seen an adult with it. But in movies and TV shows, it's constant, this arch enemy, they hate each other. It's an interesting concept. Because when I think of the word enemy, I think of World War I, I think of World War II, I think of Ukraine, Russia, I think of what's happening in the Middle East. I think of countries at war with each other, being enemies with each other. I never think of it as like a personal relationship with someone else. I don't know, I never really thought of that. I was like, there are some people I don't like, but I wouldn't say they're my enemies. It's an odd phrasing. But that's what Paul says. And I wonder then, are these people warped up in so much hatred for each other? What does it even look like to be an enemy of someone? Not at war with someone, but an enemy of someone. What does that mean? And then what does it mean to be an enemy of God? I wonder. What does that look like? Is God warped in anger, hatred towards us? He wants the worst for us. He would rather see us, the worst things happen to us than not. That doesn't sound like God. But Paul is telling us we are enemies of God. I imagine, this is just my wonderings, is it more like we have made God our enemy, and yet God is still trying to show us love? That actually we've said to God, you're our enemy, God. And God's like, I didn't know about that. I didn't agree to this. And God's just trying to restore us, and we're just like, yeah, nah, God. That's what Paul's saying our relationship with God is like. And now we know the next part of the story. We know the end of the story, that Jesus comes, he lives, he dies, he's resurrected, we are restored. Can we forget that story just for a moment, that ending? I want to stay in this problem story. I want to stay in the story where we are described as helpless, ungodly, sinners, and enemies. These are the words from Paul himself. He's not sugarcoating it. He's given us an explicit image of how our relationship is with God. He's saying it as it is. That's just how it is. While we were these things, God demonstrates his love for us. While we were helpless, ungodly, enemies, and sinners, God does something radical. Now, I don't know if you've seen the beautiful words on our wall. If not, there they are. Absolutely gorgeous. We've talked about radical a lot, and it's in bold. But I honestly believe Jesus has done something quite radical. God has done something radical. And I want to use a story from my own experience. This is probably going to relate more to the younger high school students, I hope, than maybe anyone else. But I'm sure you'll be able to get something from it. I was 17 years old at morning tea or lunch or interval, whatever you call it these days, right? A friend of mine, she was having some problems at home. Life wasn't that great. So we were talking, chatting it through. She started crying. She was upset about what was happening at home. I was comforting her, just offering her a listening ear. Bell rang. She was feeling okay. I was like, okay, we'll talk after class. I went to math. Good old math class. Who loves math, right? Honestly. Thanks, Riley. Sitting in math class next to a friend, close friend. We were good mates, been friends probably since year 10, so like 3 years. 5-10 minutes into the class, he starts beating me. Like, flipped the table in front of him, just boom, boom, started throwing punches, laying into me. I was dumbfounded in the moment. He got me a few times. I was able to like sort of protect myself a little bit. This other guy, who I was good friends with, he's 6'2" in year 11, so like big guy, just comes up along, picks up this little dude. He's only 5 foot something, so he just literally picks him up, carries him away. I make my escape. He gets suspended. We were friends. In that moment, he made me his enemy. Something happened in him that we're no longer friends. I'm not going to share what that was yet. We're going to move on to the story of Jesus. Because God does something radical while we're still enemies. God does something so radical that we should not become apathetic and just excited. We should be passionately following this guy because he's done something incredible. He sent his son. Now, who here's a parent? Who's had kids, got kids at home? Now, my 2-year-old, Rosella, you've probably seen her running around causing all sorts of chaos. It's absolutely beautiful. We can now ask her to put things in the rubbish bin. And she loves doing it. Sometimes. 50-50 it gets there or not, who knows? So, Rosella, can you do this? Yep. Halfway there, sees a butterfly. She's gone. You know? Or she can maintain her task and do it. That in no way is the conversation that I imagine the Father and Jesus having when the Father sent Jesus to earth. It wasn't oh, hey, can you just go do this like real casual thing for me? It was an intentional, Jesus, I need you to do something. You need to go to this place. You need to save these people because they cannot save themselves. I need you to do what they cannot do. You're going to cry out for it to stop. But I need you. They need you. We need him. Jesus came to save us from our helplessness, our ungodliness, to make us friends with God and to redeem us from sin. There was no half thought. It was the only way. So Jesus came, died, and rose again while we were still broken, while we were still sinners. And that's the reason we're here today at church, isn't it? Really? We've all encountered in some form that radical love of God. We've heard the story of Jesus and we've responded in a way that makes us passionate followers because we're coming here. But we don't come because we've got it all together. We don't come because we're perfect. We come because we recognize the need for Jesus. We acknowledge how broken we are. We acknowledge how much we need Jesus. Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. Those were Jesus' words. And Paul is telling us that this sin has infected and affected all of us. And so the radical act of Jesus coming shows us God's radical love, and it has set us apart from everything else. And then this radical love calls us to live in a different way. So we're not called to live in the same way as we used to. We're called to live in a different way, a way that shows the world that we've been set apart. Jesus sums it up beautifully. People will know you are my disciples because the way you love one another. Christ has saved us from something we cannot save ourselves from. And that, my friends, is radical. Paul goes on to explain this even further, saying people wouldn't, and this is back in Romans, people really wouldn't give up their lives for a good person. Someone who is kind, caring, morally good person. Let alone someone who is not a good person. And yet that's exactly what Jesus does, is gives himself up for each one of us who are broken and sinners and ungodly and enemies of God. Jesus showed us what radical love looks like by sacrificing himself so we can be reconciled to the Father. Now, it's not new information. I hope it's not. It might be for you. We've probably heard this story at some point, in a kid's story or even on a Sunday morning if you attend here often. We're able to see the radical nature in God, God's relentless pursuit for us. He stopped at nothing to reconcile us. So my first question, does your life reflect the radical love that Jesus has freely given to you? If you were to sit honestly, reflecting honestly, does your life reflect the radical love that Jesus has given to you? Even as I ask that myself, parts of me come to my mind and going, actually, Jesus, I need to let you into these places because I'm still not perfect. The young people know that when I first encountered Jesus, I was truly transformed. I was a horrible teenager to my parents. I was not a nice person. And only through the radical transformation of Jesus did that get changed. I was challenged to live in a different way, and I still am, to be fair, as it should for all of us. I'm going to continue my story from earlier, because I sort of left it on a cliffhanger. That was the whole point. We're going to call him Benji. This was a true story though, okay? He was suspended, obviously, for beating someone up in the middle of math class. That's not a thing you should be doing at school. It's not something that they sort of encourage. I can't remember for how long, but the principal called a meeting. His parents, him, his counsellor, the dean, the principal, myself, and my parents. I can't remember what was said exactly, but I remember the principal looking at me, asked me what, I don't know why asking me what I wanted to happen to him. My words were, if he leaves this school, he's not getting another opportunity. He has to stay at this school. He needs to learn. Pakuranga College is a brilliant school, good learning and good support for students. If he went to the alternative, he wouldn't have got the same education. I forgive him. Those were my words. He was allowed to return to school after his suspension, of course. 2 things made it possible, according to the principal. First thing, he showed remorse in counselling. He realised he made a mistake. Second thing, I didn't hold a grudge. I forgave him. His education was more important than his education being stopped because he made a simple mistake. Now, I'm drawing on a parallel here. I don't know if you can see it yet. The parallel is this. The forgiveness that I offered to Benji is in no way close to the same forgiveness that Christ has offered us. But it's a parallel. I forgave Benji and he was able to return to school. God forgave us and we've been able to return to the Father. A mere parallel. The levels, please hear me when I say that they're not the same thing. They are not the same thing. Just a parallel, just a metaphor or a story that illustrates this. I'll finish that story later again. So close. And after all of this, all these words that Paul's described us as, he ends the passage in the most beautiful way. We've been called friends of God. And that's only been achieved through Jesus. Now, I said earlier, what would you do if you're walking down the street and someone was yelling these horrible words at you? But then I wonder, what would you do if someone was yelling, hey friend? The difference. Jesus did what we could not do. The price of sin was death. Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And in which through him, we are now called friends of God. Which in comparison to enemies shows us something beautiful. My point is this, that the radical act and love of God has happened so that we can be restored to the Father. Reconciliation was always the plan. And now that you and I are called friends of God, we have a very important role to play. That is to show others the same radical love that we've experienced. How do you do that? Some people ask. Do we have to go back on the street corners with a Bible in hand preaching the gospel? I don't know. The way I see it happening naturally in our community is in the way we parent our kids, and the way we treat our spouses, the way we don't talk smack about our co-workers in the break room when they make a mistake. It's the way in which we hold ourselves as we walk into a meeting. It's the way we own up to our mistakes when something happens and we apologize and say, sorry, that missed the mark. Christ calls us to be different. There is no point experiencing the radical love of Christ if it does not call us to be different. In a podcast I listened to, sent to me by Joseph, thanks Joe, by Daily Thunder podcast entitled No Compromise Spiritual Lessons, Leslie Luddy says this: if we've found the truth, why have we become apathetic? Why would the church live like the rest of the world when they have found the truth, the way, the truth, and the life? Essentially, she's challenging each one of us to live a life that Christ calls us to. It's not a legalistic perspective saying you must do this, but it's actually a life of freedom that has experienced radical love, radical transformation, and that we're passionate about sharing that love with other people. The last part of my story. A few weeks after, when he was finally back at school, we were obviously separated from classes. We had the same friend group. And we started chatting again. And we actually became really good friends. Probably closer than we did before the incident. A parallel story to how we were once friends with God. Adam and Eve. Then sin entered the world. Genesis 1 and 2. Then the rest of the Old Testament, Israel trying to fulfill the laws of God to be reconciled and to be perfect with. And then finally Jesus came to restore it all. Through and Jesus' radical love, nature, and his actions, we are now called friends of God. A parallel story. What's really interesting is 6 years later, after this event happened in my life, I was employed at the same school as a 24/7 youth worker. It's very much similar to what Letitia's doing now at Puketapu. It was for a company called Young Life, and I was there for a while. Same principal, same counsellor, same dean, still worked at the school 6 years later. We were just talking in the staff room one day, each of them at different times and over a week or so. He pulled me aside and they said, I still remember that. I still remember your story. And I was like, what are you on about? No idea what they were talking about. You know when you got beaten up in class? I was like, yeah, like in front of all these people. I was like, that's embarrassing. And he's like, no. And how you forgave him? I was like, whoa, I've forgotten this story. And then they asked me, so why'd you do it? Why did you forgive him? And I just looked at them, and I remember saying this, clear as day. I just said the Lord's Prayer. I didn't say the Lord, I said the words, the Lord's Prayer. Now these are all non-Christian people, and they're like, what? And I just whispered the words, forgive others as Christ has forgiven you, or forgiven us. Now I would love to say that in that moment, they were saved, and that we baptized them in the local swimming pool. That didn't happen. I have no idea what happened with their spiritual journey after that. But what is interesting is that they remembered that story 6 years later. And so my point is we don't know the difference, the impact that we're making around us just by living our lives and living our faith. We're not to hide our faith. We're not to try and live differently. Well, no, sorry, we are to live differently, aren't we? Actually, that's what I've been saying the whole time. We are to live differently, but we're not to live as the world, but we're to live as Christ calls us to. I'm just going to ask the music team to come up. And so my challenge for all of us today is this. I don't tell this story to look and say how perfect I am. That's not the point of that story. I tell it to say, look how much God has done. Look at how much God does and works in the world around us. So my challenge for all of us today, let us not become apathetic because we know the story of Jesus. Now hear me. But rather, let us become radical because we know the story of Jesus. Because we know Jesus so well, and you've probably heard this story hundreds of times, and it becomes, just another sermon, it's nice. But rather, if we let it seep into our bones, the story of Jesus, the radical love of God, if we really let that seep into us, how does that call us to live differently? So if you're here today feeling apathetic, feeling finished, coming to church because that's what you ought to do, can I encourage you to ask for prayer? Find someone and ask them to pray for you. If you're feeling tired and weary, if you're feeling overwhelmed and angry, if you're feeling frustrated because life is hard, find someone you can talk to. Find someone in which you can pray with. Now, I'm not saying prayer is going to change your situation. Not at all. But I'm saying by making yourself available to God, by letting God speak into that situation, it can change your perspective on that situation. I want us to pause for a moment and just wait on the Spirit to let the Holy Spirit come as we reflect and think about where does God need to show up in my life? What things am I holding back? Let us become radical because we know the story of Jesus. And if you don't know Jesus yet, if you're still on that journey, ask someone. You can ask myself, you can ask anyone on the music team. Find someone you trust and ask them, how do I encounter Jesus? Thanks, team.